On a freezing winter night, a little girl who had never spoken a single word wandered into the storm. There she met a scarred German Shepherd puppy who offered her the smallest gift, a piece of bread. In that moment, something unimaginable happened. Her first fragile word broke the silence of 10 years. From that night on, the bond between the child and the puppy grew stronger, carrying them through fear, fire, and doubt. But what this small German Shepherd did next would leave the entire town speechless. What really happened? The mountain town of Everwood lived in silence most nights. Winter had a way of pressing down on the roofs, the fences, and the narrow streets, wrapping everything in white. That night, however, the silence was broken by the howl of the wind. Snow drove hard against windows, rattling them in their frames, and drifts rose high enough to bury fences and blur the edges of the houses. Inside a modest wooden home at the far end of the street, Sheriff Lucas Warren pulled on his heavy coat. The fur-lined collar brushed against his jaw as he checked his duty belt, making sure his flashlight, radio, and holster were secure. At 38, Lucas had a strong frame and a weather-creased face, the look of a man who had spent too many nights out in storms like this. His gray eyes, though softened, when they fell on the small figure curled up on the couch. Lily Warren, his 10-year-old daughter, sat with her knees drawn up under a thick quilt. Her golden hair spilled over her shoulders, and in her arms she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, its ears floppy and its fur rubbed thin from years of holding. Lily had been silent since the day she was born. No doctor could explain it. She had never spoken a single word, not even a sound. Her world was made of drawings, hand gestures, and the steady, loving presence of her father. Lucas knelt beside her, brushing snow from his gloves. "I won't be long, sweetheart," he said gently, though he knew she could only catch the meaning from his tone. "There's a truck stuck on the mountain road. I have to help." He tucked the quilt tighter around her and added another log to the fireplace. Flames leapt high, filling the room with orange light and crackling warmth. Lily watched him with wide, luminous eyes. She understood when he left the house she would be alone in the storm's roar. She held her rabbit tighter, as though it might chase away the loneliness. Lucas placed a quick kiss on the top of her head, then stood his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He hesitated by the door, his hand lingering on the knob. For a moment he considered calling a neighbor to sit with her. But time was short, and the accident up the pass couldn't wait. "Stay by the fire," he said softly, knowing she could at least feel the reassurance in his voice. "I'll be back before you know it." Then he stepped into the night, pulling the door closed behind him. The house seemed to groan once he left. The wind pushed against the windows, whistling through the cracks, and the rafters creaked under the weight of snow. Lily sat quietly listening to the storm, like a child listens to the sea, frightened but drawn to it. She set her rabbit carefully on the table and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, the world was blurred white and endless, the lamps along the street swallowed by the snow before their light could touch the ground. She pressed her small hand to the cold pane. For years her world had been limited to the safe boundaries of this house, her father's voice, her drawings, and the pitying smiles of neighbors. Tonight, though, something stirred inside her, a restless pull. Maybe it was the loneliness of the empty house. Maybe it was the memory of her mother gone 5 years, who once sang to her during storms. Or maybe it was simply the way the snow seemed to call her, daring her to step outside. She turned from the window and walked quietly to the back door. Her father's coat still hung on the rack, but she reached instead for her own pale blue jacket. The zipper stuck halfway, and her mittened hands struggled, but she managed to pull it up to her chin. She slid her feet into small boots, wrapped her scarf around her neck, and grabbed her stuffed rabbit from the table. Then, as if pulled by an invisible hand, she opened the door. The cold hit her like a wall. Her breath rose in clouds as she stepped into the storm. The snow was deep, nearly to her knees, but she pressed forward, clutching her rabbit close. Behind her, the house glowed with firelight through the frosted window. Ahead of her stretched the wide white world, muffled and strange. Each step was swallowed almost immediately by falling flakes. The storm howled around her, but to Lily, who had never spoken, silence had always been her companion. She walked down the lane past fences, half buried, past houses dim and shuttered. The wind tugged at her scarf and her cheeks burned with cold, but she kept moving, pulled toward the unknown. At the edge of town, where the houses thinned and the old brick buildings stood dark, Lily paused. The storm seemed heavier here, pressing down on her small frame. She shivered and hugged her rabbit tighter. That was when she felt it, the sense that she was not alone. From the shadow of a crumbling alley came the faint sound of movement. She turned her eyes wide. At first, all she saw was the swirl of snow. Then a shape emerged, small four-legged fur dusted with white. A pair of amber eyes blinked at her through the dark. It was a German shepherd puppy, no more than a few months old. Its coat was thick but unkempt, streaked with frost. It was thin ribs faintly visible beneath the fur, and its paws were raw from the frozen ground. Around its neck, beneath the fur, a faint ring of scars marked where a chain had once been. The puppy shivered, but its eyes never left Lily. For a moment they simply stared at each other. The snow fell more slowly between them, as if the storm itself held its breath. Lily's mitten tightened around the rabbit, but she didn't step back. Something in the puppy's gaze, tired, cautious, but not cruel, kept her still. The puppy tilted its head, then sniffed the ground. In its mouth it carried a small crust of bread, scavenged from who knows where. Hunger gnawed at it, but instead of eating it, limped forward. Slowly, carefully, it dropped the bread at Lily's boots. Lily blinked in surprise. She looked down at the bread, then back at the puppy. Her heart pounded. No one had ever offered her anything like this before, not even another child. She crouched, her fingers trembling as she reached for the crust. The puppy didn't growl or flinch. It only sat in the snow watching her, its tail giving one uncertain flick. She raised the bread to her lips. It was dry hard, but something about the gesture felt sacred. She bit into it. And then it happened. Her chest tightened. A heat spread through her throat as though something locked inside was breaking free. Her lips parted, and from her mouth came a sound fragile, cracked, but real. Dad. The word escaped into the storm, thin and trembling, but strong enough to shake the air. At that exact moment, a beam of headlights cut through the snow at the end of the alley. Boots crunched fast against the ice. And there, through the storm, came Lucas Warren. His breath ragged, his face pale with fear. He had returned early, unable to shake the worry gnawing at him. He had called home, heard nothing, and raced back through the storm. He froze when he heard the word. For a heartbeat, he thought it was the wind playing tricks. But then he saw Lily, small and pale, clutching her rabbit in one hand and the crust of bread in the other. Her lips moved again. Dad Lucas stumbled forward, falling to his knees in the snow. He gathered his daughter into his arms, clutching her tightly against his chest. Tears burned his eyes as he buried his face in her hair. "Oh my God. Lily, you spoke," he whispered, his voice breaking. "My girl, you spoke." The puppy sat a few feet away, chest heaving, its amber eyes gleaming through the snow. It didn't bark, didn't move. It simply watched, steady and calm, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. Lucas pulled back just enough to see his daughter's lips again. "Say it again," he begged softly, though he was half afraid it had been only a dream. Her voice cracked, but it came once more. "Dad." Lucas let out a broken sob and hugged her tighter. The storm still howled, but to him the world had changed forever. Behind them, the puppy gave a single short bark, sharp against the night. It was not aggressive. It was more like a proclamation, a small creature announcing to the storm that a miracle had taken place. That night, in the middle of a frozen alley in Everwood, 3 figures sat together in the snow, a weary father who had prayed for years, a daughter who had never spoken, and a stray puppy with scars around its neck. Outside, the storm raged on, but in that small circle of light and warmth, something impossible had been born. And though no one else was there to see it, the moment would soon ripple across the whole town, changing not only the lives of Lucas and Lily, but the story of Everwood itself. The storm did not ease after Lucas carried his daughter back to their home. Snow still pressed against the windows, the night still shook with wind, but inside the little house, a fire glowed, snapping and popping as it chewed through the logs. Lucas sat on the couch with Lily wrapped in his arms, her stuffed rabbit squashed between them, and he still couldn't stop whispering her name. "You spoke, Lily. You said my name." His voice trembled. He kissed the top of her head again and again, as though to prove she was still there, still real. Lily's face rested against his chest, her small breaths uneven from the cold. Her lips had formed that word Dad twice now, 2 times in a world that had been silent for 10 long years. He wanted to ask her to say it again, but he could see how tired she was. The effort had drained her. For a child who had lived without sound, a single word was like climbing a mountain. He tucked the quilt tighter around her and whispered, "Rest, sweetheart. Tomorrow will be brighter." But in his heart, Lucas knew something else had been part of the miracle. He looked toward the door. The puppy, the German Shepherd pup, had followed them to the porch, snow clinging to his fur in tiny white flecks. Now from outside, a faint whine reached Lucas's ears. He stood slowly easing Lily onto the couch and walked to the door. When he opened it, a gust of freezing air rushed in swirling snow across the floor. And there the puppy sat, small body, trembling eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Lucas crouched in the doorway. "You," he murmured. "You gave her that bread." His voice carried disbelief, gratitude, and suspicion all at once. The pup wagged its tail once weakly and lowered its head as if unsure whether it was welcome. Lucas hesitated. He had seen dogs like this before, half wild, abandoned, sometimes dangerous. But then he thought of Lily's voice. He could not ignore that. With a quiet sigh, he stepped aside. "Come in, little one, at least for tonight." The puppy took one cautious step, then another, leaving wet paw prints across the wood floor. Snowflakes melted on its fur, dripping onto the rug. It sniffed at the air, at the warmth of the fire, at the scent of Lily's quilt. Finally, it circled once and lay down near the hearth, curling into a small ball of fur. Lucas watched with wary eyes, but Lily sat up, her gaze fixed on the puppy. Her small hand trembled as she reached out. The pup lifted its head, ears twitching, then slowly inched closer. Their fingers and fur touched. Lily smiled a real smile, wide and unguarded, and though no sound left her lips, the glow in her eyes said everything. The storm raged through the night, but inside the Warren home, something had changed. Morning came with pale light sliding across the windows. Snow lay in thick waves across the street, piled against fences and doorsteps, burying cars beneath white mounds. Smoke rose from chimneys, the only sign that life still stirred beneath the blanket of winter. Lucas brewed coffee in the kitchen, rubbing at his tired eyes. He had not slept much, still shaken by the memory of Lily's voice. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it again, fragile but real. Dad. When he returned to the living room, Lily sat on the floor in front of the fire. Her quilt draped over her shoulders, her rabbit beside her. And the puppy, Snow, now melted, fur still patchy and tangled, lay sprawled against her side. Its nose twitched with each breath, its paws twitching in little dreams. Lucas leaned against the doorway, watching. For years he had begged for a miracle. He had sat in doctors' offices, signed forms, listened to explanations that ended with shrugs. He had prayed at his wife's grave, whispered promises into the cold night. And now the answer had come not from medicine, not from science, but from a half-starved puppy who had shared a piece of bread. He cleared his throat softly. Lily looked up, her face glowing in the firelight. She pressed her lips together, then opened them slowly, trying to form a sound. Her first attempt was no more than a breath. Her second was a faint whisper. Shh. She faltered, coughed, and looked at her father unsure. Lucas's heart clenched. He crouched beside her. It's okay. Try again, sweetheart. Take your time. She stroked the puppy's fur, steadied her breath, and tried once more. Dow. The word was broken, halting, but it was a word. A new word. Lucas froze. Tears blurred his eyes as he looked at her, at the pup, at the miracle before him. Shadow, he repeated softly, his voice thick. You're naming him? Lily's small smile widened. She whispered again, clearer this time, Shadow. The puppy lifted its head at the sound tail thumping against the rug as though it already understood. By mid-morning, the storm had begun to settle. Roads were buried drifts pressed against windows, but the sky had softened from gray to pale white. Lucas shoveled a narrow path from the porch, his breath clouding in the crisp air. As he worked, neighbors emerged from their own houses, bundled in coats and scarves. Everwood was the kind of town where news traveled fast, even faster than the wind. Margaret Sloan from the hardware store waved from her porch. Sheriff folks are saying your Lily spoke last night. Is it true? Lucas straightened, gripping the shovel handle. His first instinct was to protect the moment, to keep it private. But he saw the hope in her eyes and knew the town needed hope as much as he did. He nodded once firmly. Her hand flew to her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. Oh, bless her. Bless that child. She turned back into her house, calling the news to her family. Within minutes, voices carried down the street, whispers spreading like fire. By the time Lucas returned inside, the story was already racing from door to door. Everwood was waking to a miracle. That afternoon, Benjamin Clark, the old baker, trudged up the path with a paper bag tucked under his arm. His white beard was frosted with ice, his back bent, but his smile was warm. Sheriff, he greeted. I saw something last night, out my window. That pup, he gave your girl bread, didn't he? Lucas hesitated, then nodded. You saw Benjamin's eyes glistened. I've baked bread for 50 years. Thought I'd seen everything. But a puppy half-frozen sharing his last crust with a child. That's no accident. That's a gift. He handed the bag to Lucas. Inside was a fresh loaf, still warm. For the pup, the old man said, for Shadow. Lucas's throat tightened. Thank you. But not everyone greeted the story with joy. Later at the auto shop on Main Street, Jacob Hale leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, grease stains on his coveralls. He listened as neighbors told the tale, shaking his head slowly. You're all blinded by sentiment, he muttered. That's no miracle. That's a stray. Mark my words, dogs like that don't forget training. You don't know where he came from. Could be dangerous. His words carried weight, planting seeds of doubt among some. Everwood was a small town, cautious and scarred by its own hardships. People wanted to believe in miracles, but fear was easier to hold. As evening fell, Lucas sat once more by the fire. Lily leaned against him, her rabbit in her lap, Shadow curled at her feet. The warmth of the flames painted the room in gold. Outside, the snow reflected moonlight, turning the street into a quiet, glowing sea. Lucas brushed his daughter's hair back gently. We'll need to take him to the vet tomorrow, he murmured, more to himself than to her. See if he's healthy. Find out what scars he carries. Lily looked up at him, her lips parting. She whispered soft but steady, Shadow. Lucas closed his eyes and pulled her close. The town could argue, neighbors could doubt, but he had seen the truth, with his own eyes. His daughter had spoken because of this small, battered pup. That was a miracle no fear could erase. And so, on the second night, Everwood slept beneath a sky heavy with stars, the storm finally resting. In a modest wooden house at the edge of town, a father, his silent daughter, who was learning to speak, and a puppy with amber eyes, shared their first quiet peace together. But the footsteps Lily had left in the snow the night before the trail that led to the alley to the meeting with the pup had already melted away. The world might forget them, but for Lucas and Lily, those footsteps were the path to something entirely new. The next day in Everwood rose gray and still, as though the storm had stolen the color from the world. Snow-covered rooftops and fences and narrow lanes wound through white drifts like frozen rivers. In the Warren home, the fire had burned low, but steady its smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Inside, Lucas stirred awake in his armchair. He had not meant to sleep there, but exhaustion had claimed him, with Lily curled against his chest and the small puppy sprawled across the rug. The quiet was thick, broken only by the pop of the embers and the slow breathing of his daughter. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt alive. Lily shifted under the quilt and blinked her eyes open. She sat up slowly, her golden hair tangled, the stuffed rabbit still clutched in one arm. Her gaze went immediately to the puppy. He raised his head, ears twitching, and his tail swept across the floor in a clumsy wag. The sight drew a faint smile across her lips. She reached out her small hand, and the pup shuffled closer, pressing his damp nose into her palm. She mouthed the word again, the one she had whispered the night before. Shadow. Her lips trembled as she pushed the sound into the air. It cracked uneven, but it was real. Shadow. Lucas, stirring at the sound, froze. He turned sharply, his gray eyes wide. His daughter's lips had formed the word, and sound had left her throat. It was halting frail, but it was the second word she had ever spoken. First had been Dad, born out of desperation in the storm, and now in the calm of morning, a name. Not his name, but the name she had chosen for the puppy. He felt his chest tighten, a flood of gratitude and disbelief washing through him. He knelt beside her, his voice hushed and rough. That's his name, isn't it, Shadow? Lily glanced up at him shyly, then turned her eyes back to the puppy and repeated softer but clearer, Shadow. The pup gave a small bark, startled by his own voice, then wagged his tail harder, as if proud. Lucas pressed his hand to his mouth, overwhelmed. He had dreamed for years of hearing his daughter's voice, even just once. Now it was here, and she was not only calling for him, but giving life to another creature with her words. The day passed slowly. The snow outside made it impossible to travel far, so Lucas kept the fire going and boiled soup on the stove. He watched as Lily and Shadow moved together like they had known each other forever. She sat on the rug pointing at objects in the room, chair, cup, fire, and though no sound came for most of them, every so often a whisper escaped her lips. She tried again and again, her brows furrowed in concentration, as if the presence of the puppy gave her permission to push against the silence that had bound her all her life. And every time a faint sound emerged, Shadow responded, tilting his head or wagging his tail, encouraging her, as no teacher or doctor had ever managed to do. By late afternoon, the quiet house seemed transformed. Lucas leaned in the doorway, arms folded, his eyes damp as he watched. For years he had carried the weight of helplessness, of wanting to fix what no one could fix. He had blamed himself, blamed fate, blamed the silence itself. Now he realized the answer had arrived in the most unexpected form. A stray pup with scars around his neck and amber eyes that seemed to see into his daughter's soul. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long blue shadows across the snow, a knock sounded at the door. Lucas hesitated, then opened it to find Benjamin Clark, the old baker, bundled in a thick coat and scarf. The man's cheeks were red from the cold, but his eyes shone with curiosity. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said gently. "But word has spread. They're saying Lily spoke." Lucas's jaw tightened, unsure whether to share what felt so fragile. But Lily herself appeared behind him, clutching her rabbit with one arm and Shadow's ear with the other. She looked up at the old man with wide eyes. Benjamin leaned down slightly, his voice soft. "Hello, little one." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Lily, her lips trembling, whispered the word again, "Shadow." Benjamin staggered, his eyes filling with tears. He pressed his hand to his chest and whispered, "It's true. I saw that pup give her bread last night. I thought it was only kindness. I never dreamed it would open her voice." He looked at Lucas, his weathered face alight with awe. "That dog is no ordinary creature." By evening, others in Everwood had begun to whisper as well. Some spoke with joy, marveling at the story of the mute girl who had found her voice with the help of a puppy. Others shook their heads uneasy with the idea that a stray could carry such weight. Jacob Hale, the mechanic, muttered that it was dangerous to trust a dog with scars and unknown history. Yet even he could not deny the change in Lily. That night, as the firelight flickered low, Lucas sat with his daughter on his lap, Shadow curled against her legs. He brushed her hair back and whispered, "Sweetheart, you don't know how long I've prayed for this. For years I've wanted to hear your voice, and now because of him you've spoken. That's a miracle, a real one." Lily rested her head against his chest. Her lips moved again, soft as falling snow. "Dad." The word came easier this time, smoother, less broken. Lucas's arms tightened around her, his tears falling freely. He pressed his cheek to her hair, whispering, "Yes, I'm here, always." Shadow shifted, lifting his head to look at them. His eyes glowed in the dim light, not fierce, not wild, but steady. He gave a quiet whine, then lay his head back down, as though satisfied that his work was done for the night. In that simple room, beneath the weight of snow and silence, the first miracle had taken root. It was not a miracle of lightning or thunder, not the kind written in books of prophecy. It was the sound of a child's first word, given life by the gift of a puppy's bread. It was the beginning of something Everwood would never forget, though for now, it belonged only to them. Lucas closed his eyes, holding his daughter close, and knew with certainty that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The storm had passed, leaving Everwood buried in white silence. Streets were narrowed to tunnels carved through drifts, roofs bent under thick blankets of snow. And the pine trees that lined the hills stood like frozen sentinels. Yet beneath that stillness, something restless moved through the town. A story had begun to ripple from house to house, faster than the smoke curling from chimneys or the tracks of boots in the snow. By mid-morning, almost every home had heard it. The mute daughter of Sheriff Lucas Warren had spoken, and the cause of it all was a stray puppy with amber eyes. Lucas had tried to keep the miracle close to protect Lily from the weight of people's stares. But secrets rarely lasted in a place as small as Everwood. Margaret Sloan, who ran the hardware store, had been the first to spread the word. She had stood on her porch at dawn, shouting to her sister across the street, her gloved hands cupped to her mouth. "Lily spoke, I swear it's true. The sheriff said so himself." Within an hour, voices carried the news along the lanes, across fences, through half-open doors, where neighbors leaned out hungry for something other than snow and hardship to talk about. At the bakery, Benjamin Clark told his version, his voice breaking as he wiped flour-dusted hands on his apron. "I saw it," he said to anyone who would listen. The pup gave her bread. Not snatched, not stolen, but offered like a gift. And the moment she bit it, she spoke. First word in 10 years. Don't tell me that's chance, that's grace. Customers who came for bread left with more than loaves. They carried the story in whispers to their families, adding their own touches until it grew almost into legend before the day was done. But not all voices were soft with wonder. At the auto shop, Jacob Hale leaned on the hood of a car, arms folded, his breath clouding in the cold. "You're all fools," he said to the young men gathered around him. "That pup's no miracle. Look at the scars on his neck. He's been chained, maybe trained. Could have been a canine dropout, or worse, some guard dog gone bad. You think he'll stay gentle when he grows? You wait. The sheriff's letting danger sit right in his living room." His words spread as quickly as Benjamin's sowing unease. Some nodded, muttering about the risks of wild animals. Others shook their heads, unwilling to let fear smother the glow of something that felt too rare to dismiss. By noon, Everwood's main street buzzed with quiet debate. Inside the diner, where the smell of coffee and bacon clung to the air, townsfolk filled booths and stools, their voices low but urgent. Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman with silver hair tucked under a wool hat, leaned across the table to her husband. "If Lily spoke, then it's a blessing. That child has carried silence too long. Don't matter if it came from a dog or a star falling from the sky. We should thank God." Across from her, a younger man stirred his coffee nervously. "Or maybe it's unnatural. Kids don't just find voices overnight. Maybe that pup's been trained. Maybe it's dangerous, like Jacob says." The argument simmered, tugging the town in two directions. Hope on one side, fear on the other. Everwood was no stranger to division. Its mill had closed years ago, leaving half the town jobless, and bitterness had seeped into daily life. But this story was different. It carried both promise and threat in equal measure, and people didn't know which to believe. That afternoon, Lucas bundled Lily in her coat and scarf and led her down the cleared path into town. Shadow trotted at their side, his paws leaving tiny prints in the snow. Heads turned as they passed. Doors opened, just a crack wider. Curtains twitched, voices hushed mid-sentence. Lily clutched her father's hand tightly, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, but she walked with a steadiness he had not seen before. The puppy, too, seemed calmer, his ears pricked but not fearful, his gaze steady as though he knew he was being watched. At the bakery, Benjamin stepped out, wiping flour from his hands. His face softened when he saw Lily. "There she is," he said warmly. He crouched to her level, careful not to frighten her. "Hello, Lily." The girl hesitated, glancing at Shadow. The pup nuzzled her leg as if urging her on. Lily's lips parted, trembling with the effort. "Shh, down," she whispered. The word was faint, but clear enough. Benjamin's eyes filled with tears. He turned to the small crowd gathering behind him. "You hear that?" she spoke again. "This child's voice has come back because of him." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some smiled, nodding, moved by the sight. Others frowned, arms crossed, doubt creasing their faces. Jacob Hale stood at the edge, shaking his head. "Words don't change what that pup is," he muttered. "Scars don't lie. You let him stay one day, he'll show teeth." His voice carried farther than he intended, and a few heads turned toward Lucas, waiting for his response. The sheriff met their eyes steadily, his hand resting protectively on Lily's shoulder. "All I know," he said firmly, "is that my daughter spoke her first words in 10 years because of this dog. That's not danger. That's a gift." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, silence fell, broken only by the soft snuffle of the puppy nosing at the snow. Then slowly, some in the crowd nodded. Others turned away, unconvinced. Everwood had been given a miracle, but it wasn't sure whether to cradle it or fear it. As the day faded into evening, the story grew larger still. In homes lit by oil lamps, families repeated the tale. Some spoke of Lily's fragile whisper as proof of God's grace, a reminder that the town was not forgotten. Others warned each other to be cautious, to remember that strays carried scars and secrets. Children whispered to one another that the puppy was magic, a guardian sent to protect Lily. And all the while in the Warren home, Shadow lay by the fire, his amber eyes half closed, his small body rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Lucas sat in his armchair, Lily curled against his side. She had spoken twice more that evening, both times whispering the puppy's name. Each time her voice grew a little steadier, as if she was teaching herself to climb out of silence, one fragile syllable at a time. Lucas stroked her hair and whispered to her, "Let the town say what it will. We know the truth. We were there." He looked toward the fire where Shadow slept with his paws tucked beneath him and his throat tightened. And maybe one day, they'll believe too. Outside Everwood lay, under the weight of snow and whispers. In a town where hope had long been thin as frost, one child's word and one stray pup had set hearts racing in wonder and fear alike. And though no one could see it yet, this was only the beginning of the stir that Shadow would bring not only to the Warren home, but to every soul in Everwood. The morning after the town's whispers had filled every corner of Everwood, Lucas knew there was something he could no longer delay. Shadow lay curled on the rug near the fire. His small body finally relaxed after so many nights of cold alleys and empty stomachs. But when Lucas had bathed him gently the night before, wiping away dirt and snow, his hands had stopped at the fur around the pup's neck. Beneath the tangled coat, the skin bore deep, pale grooves, rings pressed into flesh long after the chain that made them was gone. They were scars old, but unmistakable, the kind that told a story no child should have to hear. Lucas had stared at them in silence, his jaw tight until Lily's soft hand had reached out and touched the pup's head, whispering the word that now carried so much weight. Shadow. Now, with the storm roads somewhat clearer, Lucas bundled Lily into her pale blue coat and wool scarf. She held her rabbit tight in one arm and kept her other hand fixed on Shadow's ear, as if afraid he might vanish if she let go. The pup trotted alongside them, paws sinking into the snow, head turning at every new sound. Lucas carried the leash loosely, not wanting to frighten him, but knowing it was better to show the town that even miracles could walk under a sheriff's steady hand. Their path took them down Main Street, where shopkeepers shoveled doorways and neighbors nodded or stared. Some smiled warmly at Lily. Others kept their distance, their eyes flicking warily to the pup. But Lucas kept walking, his boots steady against the snow. At the far end of the street stood the Maplewood Veterinary Clinic, a squat brick building with a green roof half hidden beneath heavy drifts. Inside, the air smelled faintly of hay and antiseptic. Dr. Clara Whitmore looked up from the counter as the bell above the door jingled. She was a woman in her 30s, with auburn hair tied back in a messy knot, freckles dusting her cheeks, and glasses slipping low on her nose. She smiled warmly when she saw Lily. "Well, Sheriff," she said, pulling off her gloves. "This must be the little hero everyone's whispering about." Lucas gave a weary nod, kneeling to unfasten Lily's scarf. "He's been staying with us. I need you to take a look. There's something I don't like." Clara crouched, meeting the pup's gaze. Shadow stiffened, at first his ears twitching, but when Lily knelt beside him and laid her small hand on his back, he relaxed with a soft sigh. Clara reached out carefully, her voice low and gentle. "Let's see what secrets you're hiding, little one." They moved into the examination room. Lily sat on the chair with her rabbit pressed close, her eyes never leaving Shadow. Lucas stood nearby, arms crossed, his face set in the grim mask of a man who expected bad news. Clara worked slowly, murmuring soft reassurances as she checked his eyes, ears, teeth, and paws. Shadow trembled but did not fight his amber eyes, flicking often toward Lily, as if drawing courage from her presence. Then Clara pushed back the thick fur at his neck, and her hand stilled. "Here," she said quietly. Do you see this? Lucas stepped closer. Beneath the fur, the skin was ridged and discolored, a ring carved deep where a collar had once bitten too tight for too long. Clara traced the scars gently, her lips pressed into a thin line. This puppy was chained. For a long time. Whoever had him didn't care if the collar grew into his skin. That's not neglect, Lucas. That's cruelty. Lucas felt his stomach twist. He brushed his hand across his mouth, steadying his breath. So he belonged to someone. Clara nodded. Yes. And not just anyone. She ran her hand down the pup's lean frame. Look at his build. Strong, even though he's underfed. His ears are clipped just a little shorter than most shepherd pups. That's common in training programs, military, police, private security. My guess, he was started in a program like that, then discarded. Maybe they thought he was too small, too sensitive, or maybe someone simply gave up on him. She sighed. But he's no ordinary stray. The words hung in the air. Lucas stared at the little creature, his heart caught between anger and awe. He had seen cruelty in his line of work, but to think someone would throw away a life like this to leave a pup scarred and starving in the snow, it hollowed him. And yet, here Shadow was not broken. Not bitter, but the very reason his daughter had spoken. Lily, listening intently, though she understood only part, pressed her lips together. Then she leaned close to the pup, her voice trembling but certain. Shadow. Both adults froze. It was the clearest she had spoken, yet her tone carrying both affection and ownership. Clara blinked rapidly, her eyes misting. Lucas's throat constricted as he knelt beside his daughter. You're naming him, he whispered. You're giving him a home. Lily nodded once, clutching her rabbit tighter. Shadow, she repeated, firmer this time. The puppy pressed his head into her knee as though sealing the bond. His tail thumped softly against the floor, and for a moment the room felt filled with something bigger than words. Clara straightened, brushing at her eyes. Sheriff, she said softly, that pup didn't just survive cruelty. He carried something with him. Whatever he went through, it didn't break him. And maybe he was meant to find her. Lucas swallowed hard, unable to speak. He looked at his daughter's small hands, buried in the pup's fur, at the glow in her eyes, and he knew Clara was right. He had prayed for years, begged for something to unlock the silence. No doctor had managed it. No therapy had lasted. But this scarred little puppy had done what nothing else could. When they stepped out of the clinic, a small crowd had gathered despite the cold. News traveled faster than footsteps in Everwood. Margaret Sloane stood bundled in her red coat, her cheeks flushed as she asked, "What did the vet say? Jacob Hale was there too?" Arms folded, his mouth set in its usual scowl. Lucas felt their eyes all over him, waiting for his word. He placed a steady hand on Shadow's back. He's scarred, he admitted, chained, abandoned. But he's alive. And my daughter... He looked down at Lily, who hid her face in his coat for a moment, before whispering softly into the hush, Shadow. The sound carried across the crowd, thin but undeniable. Murmurs rose immediately. Some gasped, hands pressed to mouths. Others shook their heads, muttering darkly about danger. Jacob snorted, his voice cutting through. A trained dog gone wrong, that's all I see. Dogs don't forget commands, Sheriff. You're bringing risk into your own home. Lucas's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Benjamin Clark stepped forward. His apron was still dusted with flour, his eyes fierce with conviction. I saw what he did, the baker declared. That pup gave her bread when no one else could give her hope. She spoke because of him. You call that danger, I call it a miracle. The crowd murmured again, divided between fear and faith. Lucas looked at Shadow, then at Lily, who clung to the pup's ear like a lifeline. He felt the choice settling heavy on his shoulders. As sheriff, he was sworn to protect the town. As a father, he had just witnessed his daughter's first words because of this small creature. Between law and love, between fear and hope, he knew where his duty lay. He tightened his grip on Lily's hand and lifted his chin. He stays with us. My daughter calls him Shadow, and that's who he is now. Whatever scars he carries, they don't define him. They don't define any of us. The words didn't end the whispers. Some nodded, moved to tears, while others turned away, suspicion hardening their faces. But as Lucas led Lily and Shadow back toward their home, the little pup trotting proudly beside them, it was clear that Everwood would never be the same again. That night, as snow drifted softly against the windows, Lucas tucked Lily into bed. She pressed her rabbit into his hands, then pointed to the rug where Shadow curled. Her lips parted, and with a fragile but certain voice she whispered once more, "Shadow." Lucas kissed her forehead, his heart aching and soaring all at once. "Yes," he whispered back, "Shadow." And in the quiet that followed, broken only by the steady breathing of the sleeping pup, Lucas realized that the scars of the past, no matter how deep, had given way to something new. They had led this little dog to his daughter, and in return, given her back the gift of her own voice. The days after the visit to the clinic settled into a rhythm that felt new to Lucas, almost fragile in its peace. The storm had left Everwood blanketed in white each morning, bright with sunlight bouncing off snowdrifts, each evening softened by the glow of lamps flickering behind frosted windows. Yet inside the Warren house, change had already taken root. It wasn't in the way the fire crackled or the way soup simmered on the stove. It was in the way Lily's lips moved, hesitant at first, then braver each day, as though she was learning to trust her own voice again. And at the center of it all was the puppy she had named Shadow. Shadow followed Lily everywhere. When she sat by the fire drawing in her notebook, he pressed against her side, his head resting on her knee as if her presence was enough to still the restless trembling that sometimes shook him in his sleep. When she curled under her quilt at night, her rabbit tucked against her chest, he settled at the foot of her bed, ears pricked his small body on guard, as if daring the silence itself to come back. And when she tried to speak, whispering simple words, Dad's Snow Shadow the pup responded with bright eyes, a wagging tail, or a soft whine that encouraged her to try again. Lucas watched this bond grow with both awe and caution. He had raised dogs before, but never like this. Shadow was young, scarred, and came from unknown hands, yet there was nothing forced in the way he leaned into Lily's touch, nothing violent in the way he barked or moved. Every sound, every gesture carried gentleness, as if the cruel past that had left scars on his neck could not reach the heart that beat beneath his ribs. One evening, as the wind whispered faintly outside, Lucas stood in the doorway of the living room. His arms crossed, his breath caught in his chest. Lily sat cross-legged on the rug, her golden hair catching the light of the fire. In front of her lay a children's picture book, the kind with large letters and bright drawings. Her finger traced along the page. Her lips parted. At first nothing came, only the faint sound of air, but then she tried again, forming the shape of the word sun. The voice was faint, broken at the edges, but it was sound. Shadow lifted his head immediately, ears, twitching tail, thumping against the floor as if he understood. Lily smiled shyly, then whispered again, stronger this time. "Son?" Lucas pressed his hand to his face, his eyes stinging. He remembered long nights when he had sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, wondering if he would ever hear his daughter say even one word. He remembered the pity in doctors' voices, the sympathy in neighbors' eyes, the silence that had stretched like a wall between him and the child he loved more than life itself. And now here she was, whispering words into the firelight, guided by a puppy who had once been discarded as worthless. The next morning, when Lucas walked into the kitchen, he found Lily sitting at the table, her rabbit propped up on the chair beside her, and Shadow's head resting in her lap. She looked up at her father, her lips moving slowly, carefully. "Good morning." The words were halting, fragile, but unmistakable. Lucas froze, then rushed forward, dropping to his knees to gather her into his arms. "Good morning, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Good morning?" Shadow barked once sharp and cheerful, then nuzzled against Lily, as if proud of her accomplishment. Lily giggled an almost soundless laugh, but filled with light. For Lucas, it was music. As the days passed, neighbors began to notice the change. Margaret Sloane stopped by with a basket of muffins, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She lingered in the doorway, hesitant before stepping inside. "I heard she's been speaking," Margaret said softly, her eyes falling on Lily. The little girl stood half-hidden behind her father, but when Margaret crouched and smiled, Lily's lips parted. "Hello," she whispered. The word was shy, uncertain, but real. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached out gently. "Hello, sweetheart. You sound wonderful." Not everyone welcomed the miracle so easily. When Lucas stopped by Jacob Hale's garage to fix the patrol car, the mechanic leaned against the counter, his face set in its usual scowl. "I've heard the talk," Jacob muttered. "A girl who never spoke now saying words because of a dog. Sounds like fairy tales. And that pup of yours, scars like that don't come without reason. You can't trust a dog trained for things you don't know about. One day he'll remember, and then what?" Lucas met his gaze steadily, though his jaw tightened. He hasn't hurt her. He gave her hope. That's more than anyone else ever managed. He turned away before Jacob could answer, unwilling to let doubt poison what he had seen with his own eyes. Back at home, Lily's progress continued. Clara, the veterinarian, dropped by one afternoon with her stethoscope hanging around her neck and her auburn hair tied in a messy bun. She crouched beside Lily, watching as the girl read softly from a small book, each word halting, but growing stronger. Shadow sat pressed against her side, his ears twitching at every syllable, his gaze locked on her face, as though every sound mattered more than the last. Clara's eyes glistened as she stood and whispered to Lucas, "He's working his therapy." Whether he knows it or not, he listens. He responds. That's reinforcement no program could have given her. Lucas nodded, unable to trust his voice. He looked at the pup lying so peacefully at his daughter's feet and thought, maybe he was discarded because someone thought he was too sensitive. If so, then it was their loss. That same sensitivity was saving his daughter. That weekend, the old chapel on the hill opened its doors for the weekly service. Snow crunched under boots as families gathered scarves wrapped tight, children carried in thick coats. Lucas had not planned to take Lily. Crowds often made her retreat into silence. But she tugged his sleeve insistently, her rabbit tucked under one arm, and Shadow's leash clutched tightly in her small mitten. He studied her determined eyes, then finally nodded. When they entered the chapel, conversations hushed. Heads turned, whispers flitted through the pews. A sheriff's daughter, who had never spoken, was now standing in the aisle with a scarred stray pup at her side. Lucas guided her gently to a seat, but before she sat, Lily turned toward Shadow. She bent low, her lips close to his ear, and whispered something. At first it was too soft for anyone to hear. Then, gathering courage, she said it again, louder, though her voice trembled. "Friend." The word carried through the quiet chapel, fragile but unmistakable. A murmur rippled through the congregation. Some wiped their eyes, others bowed their heads. Pastor Elias Turner, standing at the pulpit, paused with his notes in hand, his eyes shining. Sometimes he said, his voice deep and steady, "The Lord answers prayers not with thunder, but with small living reminders of His grace." Today, we have witnessed one. Lucas felt tears burn his eyes as he pulled Lily close. He looked down at Shadow, who stood proudly at her feet, his tail wagging gently, his amber eyes fixed on her face. Friend Lucas whispered, his throat raw. "Yes, he is." That night, as Lily drifted to sleep, she curled on her side with her rabbit tucked against her chest and Shadow pressed close against her back. Her lips moved one last time before her eyes closed. "Friend," she murmured, softer than a sigh, but filled with peace. Shadow shifted, pressing his nose to her shoulder, and closed his eyes too. Lucas sat in the doorway of her room, his heart heavy with gratitude. For years he had lived with silence, with doubt, with a fear that his daughter would never cross the wall that stood between her and the world. Now, word by word, she was climbing over it, guided by a scarred little pup who had been abandoned and forgotten. Lucas knew the town still doubted that whispers of fear and suspicion would linger. But here in his home, the truth was clear. His daughter had found her voice and her first true friend. And for Lucas, no fear, no scar, no whisper from the outside world could ever take that away. Winter deepened in Everwood, and though the snow softened the world into a quiet picture of white, the air in town felt sharper than the wind that cut down the alleys. Shadow had become a familiar sight at Lucas Warren's side, a small German shepherd pup, whose ears had not yet fully stood, whose paws seemed too big for his frame, and whose amber eyes followed Lily as though she were the only reason he breathed. For Lucas and his daughter, he was no longer a stray. He was family. But beyond the warmth of their home, whispers had grown colder. Not everyone saw a miracle when they looked at Shadow. Some only saw the scars on his neck and the story those scars told. At the diner on Main Street, the hum of voices rose above the clink of coffee cups and the hiss of the old grill. Everwood's residents gathered there most mornings, stomping snow from their boots, warming hands on steaming mugs and trading stories. Since the storm, no tale was larger than that of Lily Warren speaking her first words. Benjamin Clark the baker told it again and again with a kind of trembling joy, his hands sketching the scene in the air. Margaret Sloane always chimed in, describing the way Lily had whispered hello to her at the Warren doorstep. Some nodded, tears in their eyes, but others leaned back, frowning, their arms crossed. Jacob Hale's voice always cut through the warmth like a knife. "You're blinded by sentiment," Jacob muttered one morning, his oil-stained coveralls smelling of gasoline, his dark knit cap pulled low. "That pup's no miracle. He's a stray with scars, and scars mean a past. Dogs trained for police or guard work don't forget commands just because you give them a new name. One day, that thing's going to remember. And when it does, who's going to pay the price? Maybe the sheriff's girl herself." A hush followed his words. Some stared into their cups, unwilling to argue. Others shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Benjamin slammed his hand against the table, his voice shaking. "I saw that pup offer bread to a child. Bread, Jacob. Not teeth, not fear. Bread. Tell me what kind of danger looks a starving child in the eye and chooses kindness instead." But the shadow of Jacob's warning lingered. Fear often clung harder than hope. It followed neighbors out into the streets, into the shops, into the whispered conversations carried on the icy wind. Parents pulled their children closer when Shadow passed. Doors closed a little quicker. Some even crossed themselves, as though uncertain whether the pup was blessing or curse. Lucas felt it every time he walked through town with Lily. People greeted him politely enough, he was still their sheriff, but their eyes slid quickly to the puppy trotting at his daughter's side. He could read the doubt there, the suspicion that no badge could erase. He didn't argue with them. He simply held Lily's hand tighter, let her clutch Shadow's leash, and kept walking. But the weight of their stares pressed heavily on him. One evening, as the sun sank early behind the ridge and the sky burned orange against the white drifts, Pastor Elias Turner stopped by the Warren house. Wrapped in his long black overcoat, his breath rising in clouds, he greeted Lucas at the door with a somber nod. Inside, Shadow perked his ears, sensing the tension, while Lily sat on the rug, carefully sounding out words from her picture book. "She's doing better every day," Lucas said softly, pride and wonder in his voice. She spoke 3 new words this week. Elias removed his hat and stepped closer to the fire. "I don't doubt it," he replied. "I've seen the change in her eyes. But the town is uneasy. Miracles frighten as much as they comfort, especially when they come in forms people don't understand. They see scars and think danger. They see silence broken and think it must come at a cost." He looked at Lucas, his gaze steady. "You know this fear won't vanish on its own." Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. But what am I supposed to do? Send the pup away? He saved my daughter in ways no doctor could. She's finding her voice because of him. I won't throw him back into the cold." The pastor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then show them. Don't hide him. Let them see with their own eyes what you've seen. Fear grows in shadows. But maybe if they watch long enough, they'll see what Lily sees." Later that night, as Lucas sat by the fire with Lily dozing against him, he thought about the pastor's words. Shadow lay at her feet, his small body curled protectively near her hand. Lucas studied the scars on the pup's neck, the faint lines hidden beneath the fur. He thought about Jacob's warnings about the whispers that spread so quickly. He knew the town's fear was not born of cruelty alone. It was survival. Everwood had seen too much loss, too many promises broken. It was easier to believe in danger than in miracles. But Lucas also knew that sending Shadow away would mean tearing away the light that had just entered his daughter's life, and that he could never do. The fear did not stay confined to whispers. A few days later, Margaret Sloane visited again, her red parka dusted with snow. She carried another basket of muffins, but her eyes were troubled. "Lucas," she said gently, glancing toward Lily and Shadow playing by the fire, "I thought you should know. Some folks are talking about calling the county. They say a trained dog abandoned could be a risk to the whole town. They want to see him taken to a shelter." She bit her lip. "I told them it wasn't right that they hadn't seen what I'd seen. But Jacob's voice is loud, and fear spreads." Lucas's jaw clenched. "They'll have to go through me first," he said firmly. "Shadow is staying here." Margaret's eyes softened with sympathy, but her shoulders sagged with worry. "I believe you, Lucas. I do. But not everyone will. Be ready." When she left, Lucas stood at the window for a long time, watching the snow fall in soft flakes. Lily had climbed onto the rug, pressing her rabbit into Shadow's side, whispering his name over and over, as though each repetition made her voice stronger. "Shadow, Shadow, Shadow." The pup wagged his tail at every sound, his amber eyes glowing with devotion. Lucas's chest tightened. How could anyone look at this and see danger? How could they not see the miracle that had unfolded before their very eyes? But he knew Margaret was right. Fear had taken root in Everwood, and once it did, it grew like weeds in frozen soil, stubborn, clinging hard to tear away. He didn't know how long it would be before words turned to action. All he knew was that his daughter had found her voice, her hope and her joy in this scarred little pup. And no matter what the town decided, he would fight to protect both of them. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she clutched her rabbit close and whispered one last word into the darkness. Safe. It was halting, uncertain, but it was a word. Lucas's eyes filled with tears as he leaned down to kiss her forehead. Yes, he whispered back. You're safe, as long as I'm here. As long as Shadow's here. And downstairs, curled on the rug, with his scars hidden beneath soft fur, the puppy lifted his head at the sound of his name and gave a single quiet bark as if making a vow of his own. The snow that had buried Everwood for weeks began to thaw as February rolled in. The sun lingered a little longer each evening, and the air carried the faint smell of wet pine and damp earth. But with the thaw came something no one in the mountain town expected. Winter had been harsh, but now the forest that stretched along the ridge carried scars of its own. Beneath the melting snow, dry needles and brittle branches lay tangled fuel waiting for a spark. That spark came one restless evening, carried on a sharp wind that whipped through the valley. By the time anyone noticed, smoke was already curling above the tree line. Lucas Warren had just set a pot of stew on the stove when the call came through his radio. His hand froze on the handle, the words almost too unreal to process. Fire. Not a chimney accident or a brush pile gone wrong. A forest fire spreading fast. He looked toward the living room, where Lily sat on the rug with Shadow pressed against her side, reading softly from her picture book. Her lips shaped each word, her voice whispering in fragile bursts, while Shadow wagged his tail at every sound. For a moment, Lucas wanted to stay in that picture of peace, to shut out the voice on the radio. But duty pulled him to the door. He knelt beside Lily, brushing her hair back gently. "Sweetheart, I have to go," he said, his voice steady but tight. She frowned, clutching her rabbit. "Stay here near the fire. Margaret is coming by to check on you." He kissed her forehead, his heart torn between father and sheriff. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes sharp, as if he understood. Lucas met the pup's gaze for a long moment, then rose and pulled on his coat. "Look after her," he muttered. Then he was gone, swallowed by the sirens of the town. The fire was already racing down the ridge when Lucas reached the edge of town. Flames leapt high, licking at the sky, painting the snow in red and gold. Smoke rolled thick, stinging eyes and choking lungs. Volunteers grabbed hoses, buckets, anything they could find. Families hurried from their homes, clutching children, pulling sleds with blankets and valuables piled high. The wind carried sparks that danced in the dark, tiny stars that burned wherever they landed. Back at the Warren house, Lily stood at the window, staring at the glow rising beyond the trees. Margaret had not yet arrived, delayed by the chaos. The little girl clutched her rabbit, her lips trembling. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking in the empty room. The word carried fear and longing, a sound she had once thought she would never be able to make. Shadow pressed against her leg, his fur bristling. He gave a sharp bark, then trotted to the door, scratching with his paw ears forward, as if urging her to follow. Lily hesitated. The heat of the fire was already reaching the house, the smell of smoke seeping through the cracks. Sparks landed on the porch, glowing briefly before fading. She held her rabbit tighter, tears filling her eyes. "Shadow," she whispered. The pup barked again, louder, insistent. His amber eyes fixed on hers, steady and unafraid. With trembling hands, she pulled on her coat and scarf, slid her feet into boots, and opened the door. Smoke hit her like a wall, but Shadow was already bounding ahead, pausing only to make sure she followed. They moved through the snow toward the main street, Lily stumbling as the smoke thickened. The glow of fire painted the sky above, and voices shouted in the distance. But halfway down the lane, a branch cracked overhead, breaking under the weight of heat and sparks. It crashed onto the path, scattering embers that flared bright in the snow. Lily froze, coughing, her eyes wide with terror. Shadow leapt forward, barking furiously at the wall of smoke, as though his voice could clear a path. Then he darted back, tugging at Lily's coat with his teeth, urging her to move. Step by step, coughing. Sobbing, she followed, clutching her rabbit to her chest. On the ridge, Lucas was shouting orders, his radio crackling, his throat raw from smoke. He turned once toward the street below and felt his heart stop. Through the haze, he saw his daughter, small, pale, stumbling, moving toward the fire line with Shadow at her side. "Lily!" His voice cracked with fear as he tore down the slope, his boots slipping in the ash and snow. "Lily," she heard him, her head jerking toward the sound. For a moment she faltered, choking on smoke. Then her lips formed the word, thin but strong. "Dad!" The sound cut through the roar of flames. Lucas lunged forward, his arms reaching just as she stumbled into him. He swept her up against his chest, coughing hard as he shielded her from the sparks. Shadow circled them, barking furiously, his small body defiant against the fire. Lucas staggered back toward the main road, clutching Lily tight, his other arm shielding her from falling embers. The pup darted in front of him, leading the way, barking again and again, as if guiding them out of the choking dark. They burst onto the street, where volunteers rushed forward, grabbing buckets and blankets, dousing sparks as they fell. Margaret appeared at last, her face pale with terror. She caught Lily's arm as Lucas handed her over, wrapping her in a thick quilt. The girl coughed weakly, clutching her rabbit, her lips trembling. Then, through the haze, she whispered, "Shadow." The pup sat at her feet, chest-heaving, eyes fixed on her face. His tail thumped once against the ground, steady and sure. By dawn, the fire was beaten back, though not without scars. The forest smoldered, blackened and broken. Houses near the ridge were damaged, and the air still carried the bitter smell of smoke. But the town remained standing, saved by the frantic efforts of its people. And through the weary crowd, stories already spread. They told of the sheriff's daughter, who had walked through smoke and fire, her voice calling Dad as her father fought to reach her. They told of the small German shepherd pup who barked loud enough to guide them through the flames. Jacob Hale stood on the edge of the crowd, his usual scowl faltering as he watched Lily press her face into Shadow's fur. For once, he said nothing. Even he could not argue with what he had seen, a scarred little pup standing between fire and a child, loyal and unyielding. Lucas crouched beside his daughter, brushing ash from her hair. His throat was raw, his hands blistered, but his heart was alive with gratitude. He looked at Shadow, meeting those amber eyes that held no fear, only devotion. "You saved her," he whispered hoarsely. "You saved us both." Lily lifted her head, her lips trembling as she whispered again, stronger this time, the word that bound them all together. "Shadow." The crowd fell silent, listening. And in that moment, as the sun rose weakly over the smoke-stained ridge, Everwood saw not a stray, not a scarred pup, but a friend, a guardian, a miracle standing small, but unshaken at the center of the town. Morning in Everwood came slow and heavy after the fire. Smoke still hung in the air, low and bitter, mixing with the scent of wet ash and pine. The snow that had once looked pure was now streaked with black, broken branches jutting out like bones. Yet beneath the exhaustion that weighed on every face, a quiet hum moved through the town, the story of what had happened the night before. Word traveled quickly in small places, and before long everyone knew the sheriff's daughter had survived the fire because of a puppy, a scarred little German shepherd who had barked through the smoke and led them out. Lucas woke stiff and sore, his throat raw from breathing ash. He had spent the night half sitting in the armchair, Lily curled against his chest, her stuffed rabbit tucked between them. Shadow lay on the rug, too tired to move, his small body stretched out as though he had fought the fire himself. The pup's paws twitched in restless dreams, and every so often he let out a faint whimper, but his breathing was steady. Lucas watched him for a long while, his heart aching with a mix of gratitude and fear. Gratitude because Shadow had saved his daughter. Fear because he knew how quickly gratitude could be twisted into suspicion in this town. When Lily stirred, blinking her eyes open, her first word was not Dad. It was Shadow. Her voice was hoarse but sure, and the pup lifted his head immediately, his tail thumping weakly at the sound. Lucas pressed a hand to his face, fighting tears. His daughter, who had lived in silence for 10 years, now began each day with a word shaped by love. By mid-morning, a knock came at the door. Margaret Sloane stood outside, her red coat dusted with ash, her eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. In her arms she carried a small basket, not of muffins this time, but of bandages, salves, and fresh bread. "I thought you could use these," she said, stepping inside. Her gaze fell on Shadow, who tried to rise, but wobbled too tired to stand. Margaret's eyes softened, and she crouched beside him. "So, this is the little hero," she whispered. She reached out, and to her surprise, the pup licked her hand gently, before dropping his head back to the floor. "You should know," she added, turning to Lucas. "People are talking. I was at the diner this morning. Some can't stop praising what they saw. Others—" She hesitated, her lips pressing into a line. "Others say it was chance, or that the pup just followed instinct. Jacob, of course, says it proves nothing. He still wants the county to take him." Lucas's jaw clenched. Jacob wasn't there. He didn't hear her voice in the fire. He didn't see how that dog let us out. Margaret nodded. "I believe you. And I think more people do than you realize. They just need to see it with their own eyes." She handed him the basket, her voice softening. "Give them time. Fear speaks loud, but so does truth." Later that day, Lucas carried Lily into town. He could have let her rest, but she insisted, tugging at his sleeve, whispering, "Go," until he understood. Shadow trotted beside them, his steps slower than usual, but steady, his head held high. As they walked down Main Street, people stopped in their tracks. Children pointed. Men and women set down their shovels, their conversations fading into silence. The sheriff's daughter, once silent as snow, walked with her father, and the scarred little pup who had saved her. At the bakery, Benjamin Clark stepped out, his apron smudged with flour. He raised his voice, trembling with emotion. "Here they are," he declared to the growing crowd. "The girl who found her voice, and the pup who saved her life." All eyes turned to Lily. She clutched her rabbit tightly, her cheeks flushed pink, but she did not hide. She looked at the people gathered, neighbors who had watched her grow up in silence, and then at Shadow, who wagged his tail encouragingly. Her lips parted. For a moment only air came, and the crowd leaned closer, holding its breath. Then, with effort, she whispered, "Shadow." The sound was soft, but it carried. Murmurs swept through the people, gasps breaking the silence. Some clapped, some wiped tears from their eyes. Shadow barked once, sharp and clear, and wagged his tail so hard his whole body shook. Lily smiled, small but bright, and whispered the word again, stronger this time. "Shadow." Benjamin raised his hands. "You see, she speaks because of him. Call it what you want, luck, miracle, blessing, but it is real. We can't deny what's standing right in front of us." For a moment, even Jacob Hale had no words. He stood at the back of the crowd, his arms crossed, his scowl deep. But even he could not deny the sight of Lily speaking, her hand resting on the head of the pup, who bore scars yet gave only loyalty. He muttered under his breath, but the usual certainty in his voice was gone. The crowd began to shift. People stepped forward, some kneeling to stroke Shadow's fur, others smiling at Lily with tears in their eyes. A little boy offered the pup a piece of bread, which Shadow accepted gently, wagging his tail. Laughter broke out, hesitant at first, then warm. For the first time in years, Everwood's Main Street rang with something lighter than worry or complaint. It rang with wonder. That evening, the town's small newspaper printed a story on the front page, "Little Hero Saves Sheriff's Daughter." The article told of the fire of Lily's voice, calling through the smoke of the pup who barked until help found them. The photo showed Lucas crouching with his arm around Lily's Shadow, sitting at her side, ears perked, eyes steady. The headline was read aloud at supper tables in living rooms, in the diner, over steaming cups of coffee. And though not everyone was ready to call it a miracle, no one could deny that something remarkable had happened. Back at the Warren home, Lucas sat in his armchair with Lily curled against him, her head heavy on his shoulder. Shadow lay stretched across the rug, his belly finally full, his paws twitching as he dreamed. Lucas looked at them both, his chest heavy with emotion. For years he had lived under the weight of silence, carrying the fear that his daughter would never know the world in its fullness. And now, because of a small scarred puppy, she was climbing word by word into a new life. He leaned down, whispering into Lily's hair. "You're brave, sweetheart. And so is he. You've both shown this town more courage than most of us could ever dream." Her lips moved, her voice drowsy but steady. "Hero." She reached out with a small hand to rest it on Shadow's fur. "Little Hero." The pup stirred, lifting his head as though he had heard and understood. His tail swept slowly across the floor. Lucas felt his throat tighten, his eyes stinging with tears. "Yes," he whispered. "A little hero, and more than that. He's family now." And as the house settled into quiet, the fire glowing low, the scars on Shadow's neck no longer seemed like marks of pain. They looked instead like proof of survival, proof that even the smallest, most forgotten creature could rise through fear and flame to become something greater. In the heart of Everwood, in the eyes of a father and a daughter, a little hero had been found. The morning after the fire, Everwood woke to a new kind of silence. It wasn't the heavy stillness of snow or the uneasy quiet of fear. It was the hush that followed a night when lives had been saved, when the whole town had stood on the edge of disaster and somehow held together. Smoke still drifted faint and gray over the ridge, and the smell of burned pine clung to the air. But the town itself was intact. Chimneys' puffed doors creaked open, and the world stirred awake. And with the dawn came the paper. Everwood's Gazette was no grand publication, just a handful of folded pages printed on an old press in the back of the general store. But in a place like this, it was the voice of the town. That morning, every front porch, every shop counter, every kitchen table carried the same headline in bold black letters: "Little Hero Saves Sheriff's Daughter." Below it was a photograph taken hastily after the fire had been beaten back. Lucas Warren knelt in the snow, his coat scorched and his face smeared with soot. In one arm, he held Lily wrapped in a blanket, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight against her chest. At his side sat a small German shepherd pup, ears cocked, eyes bright even through exhaustion. The scars on his neck were faintly visible, but what caught every reader's eye was the way he leaned toward the girl, as though anchored to her by something stronger than leash or hand. In kitchens across town, families leaned closer to the page. Some wiped tears they didn't expect. Others shook their heads, muttering about how fast a story could grow. But whether they believed in miracles or not, no one could ignore the sight of Lily Warren, the silent girl whispering her pup's name into the smoke. At the Warren house, Lucas found the paper folded neatly on the porch. He picked it up, brushing snow from its edges, and stared at the headline. His throat tightened as he carried it inside. Lily was already awake, curled in her quilt by the fire, her rabbit tucked beside her. Shadow lay sprawled across the rug paws, twitching as he dreamed, the tip of his tongue peeking out. Lucas sat down beside them and unfolded the paper. He showed her the picture. "Look, sweetheart," he murmured. "That's us." Lily blinked at the page, her eyes wide. Her lips parted, shaping the word slowly. Shadow. The pup stirred at the sound, lifted his head, and wagged his tail weakly as though proud of being recognized even in print. Lucas smiled through the ache in his chest. Yes, Shadow. Everyone knows now. By midday, the diner was packed with townsfolk who wanted to talk of nothing else. Benjamin Clark read the article aloud to anyone who hadn't yet gotten their copy, his deep voice shaking with emotion. "They call him a little hero," he declared, his hand pressed firmly to the page. And I say they're right. That pup has done more for this town than most of us have managed in years. Margaret Sloane nodded vigorously, her cheeks flushed. I was there when Lily spoke his name. You can't tell me it was chance. She's been silent all her life, and now look at her. That dog has given her back her voice. But in another booth, Jacob Hale leaned back with his arms crossed, his lips pressed thin. "It's a story," that's all he muttered. "A headline to sell papers. Dogs don't perform miracles. They follow instincts. And instincts can turn dangerous. You mark my words, one day that animal will show what he really is." His words carried, and some in the diner shifted uncomfortably. Fear still clung stubbornly in corners, even beneath the glow of praise. Yet this time Jacob's voice didn't drown out the others. Benjamin slammed his fist against the table. "And what do you call it when instinct leads a pup through fire to save a child? When instinct makes him give his last crust of bread to a girl who had nothing else, I call it grace." The argument swelled, half the diner leaning one way, half the other. But the headline still sat on every counter, the photograph looking back at them all. And in that picture, even the most doubtful eyes could not ignore the truth. Lily Warren was speaking. Later that afternoon, Clara Whitmore stopped by the Warren home. Her coat smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay, and she carried a small bag of ointments. She crouched beside Shadow, running gentle hands over his fur, checking his paws, his ears, his scarred neck. "He's tired," she said softly, "but healthy. A strong heart, a steady breath. Whatever chains he carried before, he's free of them now." She glanced up at Lucas, her expression firm. "The town may argue, but no one can erase what he's done." Lucas nodded, though his face was shadowed with weariness. "They'll argue anyway," he muttered. "Some see hope, some see danger. I can't change Jacob Hale's mind or those who follow him." He looked down at Lily, who sat with her hand on the pup's ear, her lips moving slowly as she practiced the words Clara had written out for her in a notebook, "Bread, fire, home." Each word was halting, but each one was new. "But I can't let them take this from her," Lucas added, his voice hardening. "She's speaking because of him. That's not a risk I'll ever surrender." That evening, as the lamps lit up across town, Lucas carried Lily to the chapel where the townsfolk had gathered for a community meeting. Smoke had damaged more than trees, and decisions needed to be made about rebuilding, about clearing, about protecting against the next fire. But when Lucas entered with Lily and Shadow, the meeting shifted. Eyes turned, whispers swirled. The sheriff's daughter walked down the aisle, her hand clutching the leash of a scarred pup who looked far too small to carry the weight of so many stares. Pastor Elias Turner stood at the front, his Bible closed in his hands. He cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "We gather tonight not only to discuss the fire, but also to remember what held us together when the flames came. It was not fear. It was courage. And sometimes courage comes in unexpected forms." His eyes flicked to Shadow, then to Lily. "This child has found her voice. This dog has stood in the fire for her. Let us not let fear drown what we have witnessed." The room stirred with murmurs, some nodding, others shaking their heads. Then, to everyone's surprise, Lily stepped forward. She looked at the crowd, her face pale but her chin lifted. Shadow sat at her feet, his tail brushing the floor. She opened her mouth, her lips trembling. At first no sound came, but then she whispered, "Shadow." The word was small, but in the hushed chapel it rang like a bell. Some gasped. Others bowed their heads, tears filling their eyes. Jacob Hale shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his scowl less certain than before. Lucas knelt beside his daughter, his arm around her. He looked out at the crowd, his voice steady. "You all heard it. You've all seen it. Whatever you believe about miracles, know this: my daughter is speaking because of this dog. I won't stand by and let anyone call that danger." The room erupted in voices, some clapping, some arguing, but the tide had turned. The headline that morning had given the town something it couldn't easily ignore. The sheriff's daughter, silent for 10 years, was speaking. And at her side, the little scarred pup was no longer just a stray. He was the little hero of Everwood. That night, when they returned home, Lucas tucked Lily into bed. She pressed her rabbit against her chest and whispered one last word before sleep took her. Home. Shadow curled at her feet, lifting his head at the sound his tail brushing the quilt as if he understood. Lucas sat in the doorway, the Gazette folded in his hands, the headline burning in his mind. He thought of the whispers, the arguments, the fear that still lingered. But he also thought of the photograph, of the way his daughter's lips had shaped the word in front of the whole town. For once, Everwood's morning paper had not just told a story. It had told the truth. And no amount of fear could erase it. The days following the fire drew Everwood closer together in ways no one had expected. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid each other now shared tools, blankets, and meals. The air still smelled faintly of smoke, but it also carried something softer gratitude that the town had survived. And in the center of every conversation, from the diner to the church steps, was the same story the sheriff's daughter had spoken, and a scarred little pup had stood in the fire for her. Still, stories weren't enough. Some in town remained cautious, uneasy about a stray. With a past no one fully understood. Lucas heard it in muttered words at the store and guarded glances at the post office. But he also saw how the tide was turning. Margaret Sloane dropped off soup nearly every evening. Benjamin Clark started leaving scraps of bread wrapped in cloth on the Warren porch for the hero, as he called Shadow. And when Lily whispered her pup's name outside the bakery one morning, a crowd gathered quietly around them, not to argue, but to listen. The sound of her voice, fragile yet clear, seemed to silence even the loudest doubts. One crisp Saturday, as the snow glittered beneath a pale sun, the people of Everwood decided to do something more than whisper. They came together with hammers, nails, and timber salvaged from sheds and barns. It was Benjamin who first suggested it, his voice shaking with determination. "That pup has earned more than scraps and a place by the fire. He's earned a home. Let's build him one." By noon, a small crowd had gathered in the Warren yard. Men carried planks on their shoulders, women brought quilts and bowls. Children trudged through the snow with buckets of nails. Lucas stood on the porch, his arms crossed, moved beyond words. Lily stood beside him, her mitten wrapped around Shadow's ear as though she were anchoring herself. The pup tilted his head at the noise and wagged his tail uncertainly, sensing the energy, but not the reason. They chose a corner near the fence where the ground lay firm and level. Benjamin set down the first plank, his thick hands steady despite his age. Jacob Hale was there too, though his face remained stern. He muttered something about sturdiness and proper design, but he kept working his hammer, striking rhythmically alongside the others. Perhaps he had not abandoned his doubts, but even he could not resist the pull of the crowd. As the frame took shape, Lily wandered closer, Shadow padding at her side. She crouched beside the growing structure, her eyes wide. "House," she whispered softly, her lips forming the word carefully. Shadow barked once, almost in agreement, and wagged his tail so hard his body swayed. Laughter broke from the workers, light and warm, and for the first time since the fire, Everwood's yard rang with joy. By late afternoon, the little house stood complete. It wasn't grand, just a sturdy wooden structure with a slanted roof wall sealed against the cold, and a doorway wide enough for a pup who would one day grow into a dog. Margaret laid a quilt inside, sewn from scraps of old fabric, soft and colorful against the wood. Benjamin fixed a small sign above the doorway, carved roughly but clear, Shadow's home. The crowd gathered as Lucas led Lily forward. She held her rabbit tightly in one arm, her other hand resting on Shadow's back. The pup sniffed the doorway hesitantly, his amber eyes flicking from the house to Lily as if asking permission. Lily bent down, her lips trembling with effort. "Home," she whispered. The word was steadier this time, shaped with certainty. She pointed toward the doorway. "Home, Shadow." The pup's ears twitched. Then, as though he understood, he padded inside, circling once before lying down on the quilt. His tail thumped against the floor, and he gave a soft, contented sigh. The crowd erupted in applause and laughter, some wiping tears from their eyes. Even Jacob stood silently, his arms folded, his gaze fixed on the pup. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. Lucas lifted his daughter into his arms, pressing his lips to her hair. "You did that," he whispered. "You gave him a home, and he gave you back your voice." Lily rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes glowing with quiet pride. That evening, after the crowd had gone and the yard lay still again, Lucas sat on the porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands. The little house stood near the fence, its roof dusted with the first flakes of night snow. From inside came the sound of steady breathing, the soft snuffle of a puppy finally at rest, in a place he could call his own. Lily sat beside her father, her quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She pointed at the structure, her lips forming the word, once more, home. Lucas nodded, his eyes stinging with tears. "Yes, sweetheart. His home, and ours too." Inside the small wooden house, Shadow stirred his amber eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. He lifted his head at the sound of Lily's voice, then laid it back down with a quiet huff. For the first time in his short, scarred life, he belonged. The chains that had once bound him were gone. In their place stood walls built by a town, a sign carved with his name, and a girl who had spoken her first true word of belonging. Everwood slept that night beneath a sky full of stars, the scars of fire still fresh, but the promise of healing stronger. And in the Warren yard, a little house with a wooden sign marked the beginning of something new. Shadow was no longer just a stray. He was home. Winter loosened its grip on Everwood at last. The snow that had buried the town for months began to sink, melting into streams that trickled down the streets and whispered through the pines. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and smoke, a reminder of the fire that had scarred the ridge but failed to consume the town. Days stretched longer, light lingered on the rooftops, and the first shoots of green pressed stubbornly through the slush. Everwood was changing, and so were those who called it home. In the Warren yard near the fence, the small wooden house still stood, its roof patched with snow, its doorway dark and inviting. Above it, the sign carved by Benjamin's hands read simply, "Shadow's Home." Inside, the pup slept most nights, curled on the quilt Margaret had stitched, his breathing soft, his tail twitching with dreams. But more often than not, he ended up padding back to Lily's room, curling against her feet, as if the word home could only be complete when she was near. Lily had changed more than anyone. Each day, her voice grew stronger. At breakfast, she whispered bread when Lucas set toast before her. On chilly mornings, she tugged at her father's sleeve and whispered coat. When the mail came, she ran to the door, Shadow bounding at her side, and whispered letter. Every word was halting, imperfect, but each was a miracle in its own right. And the town, once doubtful, now leaned in to listen. The weekly service at the chapel became a quiet stage for her progress. Pastor Elias often paused, giving her space if she wanted to speak. At first, it was only one word. "Hello," whispered shyly into the hush of the pews. Then, as weeks passed, she managed small sentences. "Thank you, Shadow Home. I'm here." Each time the congregation wept softly, their hands pressed to their hearts. The miracle they had doubted was no longer a rumor. It was a voice, fragile but true, filling the air with hope. One spring evening, when the town gathered for a festival to mark the end of winter, Lucas found himself standing on the green with Lily at his side. Lanterns swayed overhead, casting warm light across the snow-melt grass. Tables overflowed with food, music drifted from fiddles and guitars, and laughter rose into the night. Yet when Lily stepped forward, tugging Shadow's leash and raising her small chin toward the crowd, the music faded into silence. She looked at the people who had once whispered about her, who had once doubted her pup. and for a moment her lips trembled. Then she spoke, her voice thin but steady. "Miracles are real." The words were simple, but they carried like thunder through the quiet. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. Benjamin let out a broken laugh. Even Jacob Hale, standing stiff at the edge of the crowd, lowered his gaze, unable to deny what he had just heard. Lucas knelt beside his daughter, his throat thick. He pulled her close, pressing his lips to her hair. "Yes," he whispered, his voice breaking. "They are real." Shadow barked once, sharp and proud, his tail wagging furiously, as though he had understood. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers ringing against the night sky. For the first time in years, Everwood wasn't just surviving. It was believing again. That night, when the lanterns dimmed and the people drifted home, Lucas sat on the porch steps, with Lily asleep against his chest. Shadow lay stretched across the boards, his ears twitching at every sound. The sheriff looked out at the quiet town, at the stars spread wide above the ridge, and felt the weight of all the years of silence lifting at last. He remembered the first night of the storm, the crust of bread, the fragile word "Dad," breaking through the snow. He remembered the fire, the smoke, the sound of his daughter's voice cutting through fear. And he remembered the scars on the pup's neck, proof of suffering, now turned into proof of survival. "Thank you," he whispered into the dark, unsure if he spoke to God, to fate, or to the small creature lying at his feet. Shadow lifted his head at the sound, wagged his tail once, then settled back down. In the weeks that followed, Everwood carried on, but something lingered, something softer than fear and stronger than doubt. The people smiled more easily. Children ran through the streets without glancing nervously toward shadows. Even Jacob Hale softened, though he never admitted it out loud. One afternoon, when he passed Lucas on the street, he muttered, "That pup's grown stronger," and for once his voice carried no warning. Lucas only nodded, smiling faintly. He knew Jacob had seen enough to lay down his fear. As spring bloomed fully, the ridge turned green again, and the charred scars of fire slowly disappeared under new growth. The town rebuilt what had been damaged boards, nailed over blackened beams, roofs, patched fences mended. And in the Warren yard, the little house stood as a reminder that sometimes healing was not about erasing scars, but about building something new around them. Lily's words came easier with each passing week. She still stumbled, still fought to shape sounds, but she no longer feared trying. Every evening she sat with Shadow at her side, reading slowly from her picture books, her lips forming words, one after another. The pup responded to each ear's twitching tail, thumping as though each sound was a treasure meant for him alone. And each time she whispered his name clearer, now stronger. He looked at her with devotion that erased every doubt, every cruel whisper the town had ever spoken. One night, after Lucas had tucked her in, Lily sat up suddenly, her quilt falling from her shoulders. Her lips moved in the half-dark, forming a sentence she had never dared before. "Love you, Dad." The words were soft, shaky, but complete. Lucas froze in the doorway, his breath caught in his chest. Then tears filled his eyes as he crossed the room and gathered her close. "I love you too, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking. Shadow stirred at the foot of the bed, wagged his tail once, then settled back to sleep as though satisfied with the work he had helped her accomplish. In that moment, Lucas knew the miracle wasn't fading. It wasn't a spark meant to burn out. It was alive, growing, shaping their lives, word by word, breath by breath. As summer neared, Everwood no longer spoke of Shadow as a stray. He was their guardian, their little hero, the scarred pup who had given voice to a child and hope to a town. Children stopped to pet him in the street, neighbors brought scraps to his bowl, and the sign above his little house stood proud, Shadow's home. But even that name was only part of the truth. His real home was in the heart of a girl who had once been silent, and in the arms of a father who had once prayed for a miracle that seemed impossible. And so as the town moved forward, as seasons turned and life carried on, the miracle remained not in headlines or whispers, but in the steady sound of a little girl's voice, in the wag of a pup's tail, in the warmth of a home, where scars no longer told the story of pain, but of survival, love, and second chances.